And then we're going to start with the next part of the programming. So I'm going to invite Chris Hubbell, my friend, up. Chris is a managing director at Kindred Partners. Chris and I have worked together on a few searches in the past, and I think we have a good relationship. And so I invited Chris to come join us today to discuss how to demystify executive search. So Chris, I'm going to start with a very softball question for you.
Okay.
Which is, what is executive search? So can you just sort of explain what it is and how that might differ from contingency search recruiters or, yeah.
Yeah, so at a very high level, executive search is the search for an executive for a company. Predominantly, that is done through what we call retained search, which is the services are paid over the course of the search, versus contingent, which is basically on hire. If you're successful, we'll pay you. If you're not, thanks for the effort. Majority of the time, the best search consultants want to be paid during the course of the search, which is why predominantly most executive searches are done from a retained basis. Simply put, we want to be paid for the effort that we're putting in, and essentially contingent searches are done on a more volume-driven level. So you could meet a contingent recruiter and they say they're the best job for you. They could be meeting 50 people for that similar job. They could be trying to push people to 50 different jobs. It's all success driven. So those are the major differences there.
So if some of us who are interested in entering the search process, how do we connect with you, or how do we sort of get into the process to begin with?
That's a great question. So there's a number of different ways to kind of get connected to a search. I think the key thing to understand about any search is that it really is a one-to-one exercise. Typically, companies are looking to hire these people on their own before they come to us. More often than not, that process doesn't work. And so since they're going to actually pay us capital and put time into an executive search process, they want something very specific. So if I'm doing a product search for a e-commerce company, they're going to more likely than not want somebody that's coming out of consumer, either a marketplace or another e-commerce company. So there is a bit of a right search for obviously right candidate. That being said, the best ways to connect with somebody that's in search is referral based. We talk to a ton of people. That means that you're definitely going to be connected to somebody that we know, and just ask them. We take referrals all the time. They're better than cold intros. We get back to everybody, but we definitely have a bit of a prioritization based on our client needs and then where those referrals are coming from. But your best bet is to just get in contact with somebody and say, hey, I'm thinking about something new. Who do you think I should talk to? That's 95% of the introductions that are made to me.
Now, earlier you had said something to me which was really interesting, which is that if a VC makes the connection, you often will prioritize that person in terms of sort of meeting up with them for coffee or whatever. So is that? So
with my firm and the majority of the firms that we compete with, 99% of our business comes from venture firms. And so if they're sending somebody our way, just general introduction, they want us to help, that's going to go to the top of the heap, because we're basically going to help the hand that feeds us. More often than not also, those people usually are coming from a good source, right? So they have some type of interaction. They either worked with that person before they went into VC, or they're at a company that they can't get them somewhere else within their own portfolio. So there is a little bit of a vetting that's done there. But yeah, that is definitely the reason why when your business is coming from them. So.
That makes a lot of sense. So we got this question a lot because we had to send out a survey ahead of time and polled the group. What were the top questions for you? And so this question came up time and again, which is, how do I make myself stand out, right? So I'm sure you're trolling LinkedIn, going through a lot of profiles. How can one make themselves stand out to be noticed by yourself or other search firms?
Yeah, so one way to do it obviously is to highlight what you've done. You're in a position, obviously, you're all in product. You either own a product or you own a suite of products. What have you done? And it just can be a couple of sentences on a LinkedIn profile. It could be in the email that you sent, but really what you've done gives us a great indicator right then and there of what you're able to achieve and where you're going and what you're interested in and what that might be relevant for us. It might mean also that we have absolutely nothing going on that makes sense, but at least we know, and it's a good starting point.
So get a little bit more specific
yeah,
about that.
So what does that mean, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So it really kind of comes down to like what are we going to look for? So we look for when, and again, this is predominantly for private, early to growth stage companies. We look for when a person joined a company. We look for why, not necessarily personal reasons, but what the company needed. Was it a development of a product that needed to go into the enterprise? Was it a new product? Was it just scaling? Why? Why did you come into that role? We look at what you did. So if you're sharing that you built this product, it's not as much about just what the product did, it's about what the product did for the business. And that's kind of the key thing, right? Like we're looking for people that can propel the business forward and can look beyond the product itself. And that's really what separates people from taking that next step into leadership roles, is being able to expand to what the business needs and how the product's going to drive that there versus making that product perfect. And so that's the type of story we're looking for. And naturally, when you're successful at building something, it's too much for one person or for a couple of people to manage. So how did you hire? And how successful were they? Have your hires been promoted? If you're in a director, have they gone from IC to manager? What does that look like? And then how big of that team have you grown on your own? If you've taken that team from 0 to 5 or 0 to 10, like those are good indicators for us. And then naturally, how does that compare to the business? Revenue, users, et cetera. Those are the stats that we'll look for. And then the in between there is the narratives of why you made your move. What were the things that drove you to do it? And those are a little bit more of the softer side stuff.
So when I hear you talking, I think it's telling a story, right? So telling a story.
Telling a concise story.
A concise story, okay.
And it's really telling a story that's less around a personal narrative, but more around what you did to drive a business forward, and then how you grew in that. And that could be anything from having to grow a team, it could be anything from growing a product, but what that did for the business shows us that you're continuing to take those next steps. Because what we're asked to go do is find the people that are on that track of going up and up and up.
Great. And I know earlier, we were joking about this, but somewhat not joking. So I was saying to you that I find most executive recruiters lazy because if you have a VP title on your LinkedIn or resume, you're more likely to get contacted by them. But if you don't have a VP title, like, do any of us stand a chance? What's your thoughts around, if you don't have that title?
Yeah. So more often than not, we actually look more for companies than we do actually for just titles. Companies give us a better understanding of what you might have been doing versus a wider spread of companies that we may not know. And that's not necessarily a negative. It's just, it takes us way further away from what we're supposed to be targeted versus being just kind of direct and on point and more focused. So where you are, and then just having an understanding of what you did from just a pure scale standpoint. If you're managing 10 people, and a great example actually is the former leader of product at Redfin, director title, had a 20-person team. Nobody knew that, but being able to kind of see that and understand that person was ready for CPO roles, VP product roles at later stage companies, even though he had a director title. So it's the same type of thing. Understanding as much about what you've done is more important than what your title is.
So if some of us here are managing 5, 10, 15, 20-person teams, or reporting directly into the CEO, that should be part of the profile?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, you should also think about what your title is. If your title is director of product and you're reporting into the CEO, tell the CEO you're making your title head of product. If you're owning the function, you should own it. And you can make it aware to anybody that you own that function, even though you don't have a VP title. You'll get equally as much inbound as someone with a VP title.
So Chris, we're women here, and some of us have, to take a gap year or two to be able to sort of take care of our kids when they're little, or there might be reasons why we've left our companies after a year or a year and a half. So can you talk through sort of some of those things that might look like flags on the resume, and how do you perceive those sort of flags?
That's back to the story part. Okay. So there's nothing wrong with taking time. I want to take time off, to be honest with you. It's why. So if someone had a 5-year run and a good exit, or the company grew exponentially and you want to take some time off, that's great. Earned it. You should. Having a kid's an amazing thing. You should take some time off. You're burned out after founding a company that didn't work out. Take some time off. If you're doing it, every 2 or 3 years and you're not part of a $1 billion exit, at least for a couple of them, then that becomes a little bit of a question mark about seeing things through. But there's nothing wrong with taking time off, especially if you have a story around it. I think the thing to be careful about is you want to show tenure no matter what. So you want to, in many ways, you just want to kind of plan it. If you're leaving a company after a year to take some time off and you're doing it again after a year, it doesn't really matter how successful that company is. There's going to be some questions there just about how much you are committed to something. But if you have some tenure, and it doesn't have to be your full vest, but at least enough time where, hey, you were there for part of the ride and you were a contributor to it, that's fine.
That's great. So shifting gears a little bit, what are some of the top mistakes or pitfalls you see when you're looking at whether it's LinkedIn profiles or sort of talking to candidates? Like, what are some of the things that you see that people should not be doing?
It's a good question. So you kind of better answer it by what successful people do all the time.
Okay.
They're the most concise describers of what they've achieved.
Okay.
You actually see this a lot with people at Facebook. They're very succinct about what they went in to do, what the problem was, how they solved it, what was the result, and then they move on to what they went to do next. That's amazing. That's basically every bit of information I'm looking for, and somebody that had full command of really what the outcome was going to be, and could tell a story there that I'm more or less asking, okay, how did you do it? Give me more details. Give me more data. Those are the kind of things that the most successful people we see always do. So I think where you see people make mistakes is they get a little too much into the fluff of everything and less around really what they did, what they owned, and how they grew and built it.
Yeah. So don't be long-winded.
Don't fluff.
Don't fluff.
Get to, it really is just be concise, share what you've done and what the outcomes were, and don't fluff. Don't give me sort of a softer story. Don't take away from the details of the business or your personal achievements. Tell me exactly what you did, what the story is, and then why you decide to make the move afterwards.
Great. So say we met and you think, wow, I want to get this person in front of the CEO. So can you describe the rest of that search process, and what do the most successful candidates do to land that job?
So, essentially what I advise almost every CEO that I work with is that the first meeting is basically kind of like a first date. They're trying to get to know you and you're trying to get to know them. And so what really makes people the most successful is telling their story concisely, engaging with that person, asking great questions, and making sure it's a 50-50 split. You should walk away with enough information to know if you're interested, just like we're telling them to do the same. And that's a lot easier said than done. But what I find most people are successful at doing is being able to relate their experiences to what the company is trying to achieve, even if they're relatively unrelated. It could be an industry that you've never worked in before, be it real estate or even as far-fetched as agriculture. If you can relate to the problems that they're trying to solve from their description of the role, 9 out of 10 times they're going to ask you to come back and meet the team. The best thing you can do after that is really leverage a feedback loop with the search firm and who you're working with there, and even ask questions along the way, and be able to kind of talk to the quote unquote your sponsor or the CEO and kind of understand through a dialogue, like, what are you really looking for? And then just relate that. Because even if it's something that you're super interested in, it may not be a great fit for you. And you kind of have to just be honest about that. But the best way to be successful is to really leverage feedback and tailor that to your responses for every single person you meet, because more often than not, teams are not fully aligned. And so they're going to ask a lot of different questions. And so the more that you can get feedback about the experience, the business, and what your understanding of the role is, the more likely you're going to be successful.
So Chris, one of the tactics I use, and I don't know if you think this is a good tactic or not, but if I felt like the conversation was going well, I would try to drive the next step during the conversation, which is love to have a second conversation. How about coffee, or how about getting together again? So sort of drive that next step. Do you recommend that? What are your thoughts?
That's a good question. So
off script.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I like it, especially if you think it's going well, right? And I think you definitely have to read the situation a little bit there.
Yeah.
A lot of times CEOs will just defer, and they'll basically say, well, let me circle back up with the partner Kindred or whatever firm it might be. But I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think the one thing that I find interesting in the relationship between a potential candidate or a candidate and a CEO is that it's very scripted in terms of how you interact. If I'm the CEO and we're interested in you and you're interested in us, you might only talk like when you have set times. There's not a lot of like in between dialogue, and these are quote unquote marriages for 4 years or longer. And I find that like the hardest thing is for a company to get comfortable hiring somebody after 5 or 6 meetings. So what can you do? Build a dialogue, and that will enable you to push that. Hey, why don't we get together and grab coffee again and talk more about this? If you have a consistent conversation going, and that can be email. If you are building a good relationship, could be text. There's a great story that I read about a CEO who was recruiting a CTO, and over a 2-week period, they had something like 40 hours of conversation. And it was broken down almost entirely by email, text, and video chats. And they met like 5 times, which is a lot for 2 weeks, but not crazy. But they just constantly were in communication. And by the time they decided they wanted to work with each other, they got to an offer agreement in 30 minutes.
Wow, it's a great story.
Yeah, so that's what I would recommend. That's the best way to kind of move the dialogue in your favor, is share more. In an hour conversation, it's really hard to kind of come across as complete as you might have wanted to. So just follow up and push the envelope. Okay,
great. So let's assume that everything's going well. Met with the CEO several times, met with the executive team. I had multiple conversations, and then we're now down to offer. So common question that we got was negotiating that executive compensation package.
Okay.
So a lot of us don't know how to do it. So what do you recommend, especially when it comes to comp in particular? How do we think about what we should be making relative to what we are making?
Yeah, so there's a lot of data out there that 95% of people do not have access to. Search firms have access to it, and VCs have access to it. It's not actually hard to get that data. You just need to know who to ask for it. And so there is a survey that's done every year. It's called the VCECS, which is Venture Capital Executive Compensation Survey. And it's 60 or 70 different firms that actually submit, they're supposed to at least, submit all of their comp data for the year across all their portfolio companies to this. It's not always there, but it's completely gender anonymous. That data is valuable. That is what we base almost all of our offers off of. It's that data, our own data, and individual data that we get from firms. Those are the benchmarks. So when we're going to go make an offer for a VP product at a Series B company, we're looking at those 25, 50, and 75th percentile ranges, and that's it. Get that data, because that data is going to be your most valuable piece of negotiation. That's great.
So, I think we'll ask one more question, then we'll open it up to the audience for 2 or 3 other questions. Do you sort of see any differences in the search process when women enter sort of the search process versus men, and anything that, given a room full of women, and any advice for us, any pitfalls, any, sort of?
So I'm not in the interviews, so I can't see that much into it. What we do hear a lot, though, is actually there's a general desire to bring more women into executive ranks.
That's great.
I would say almost on every search, particularly with consumer companies, there's always a point in our kickoff where it's, by the way, we would love to be able to have a fully diverse slate. It is great. What goes wrong is not always directly transparent to us because we're not doing the interviews themselves. But what we do look for is essentially the best people that can tell a concise story about what they've done and then how it helps the business. And those people in general across the board are successful. So how that relates to being able to position yourself to be more successful against any competing candidate is just relating your experience to the business and what that means to continue to grow and push that business forward. And to be honest with you, if all things are equal, more often than not, venture-backed companies are going to hire a woman now. But you need to create that dialogue with that company that all things are equal.
Great. Well, I'd love to open up to the group, and we'll take 2 or 3 questions before sort of moving to the next part of the agenda. So, any questions for Chris? Over here.
So I have a question. You said that where you work makes a big difference in terms of how people perceive you. I work for a large organization, and how can I make myself more appealing to companies that is like that startup or early stage companies?
That is the toughest transition to make. And the reason being is the major concern that early stage companies is just scaling down. So you don't have really any tools, and you kind of have to build from scratch, and you don't have a lot of resources, and you kind of have to do it yourself. What we try to do is advise people to get involved in some form or another. Advise companies, work with VCs, talk to their portfolio companies, be able to kind of show some way of adding value. That kind of gets your foot a little bit in the door. The other thing also is that you really need to be able to demonstrate how you built something with very little to do it. If you can kind of demonstrate a story in which you came into a particular role and there was nothing there, they weren't going to give you resources, and you built something from nothing, and then you have references who will tune to that, you have something compelling there. You have to create that narrative, and you're probably going to have to really go out and project that story to a lot of different people. The best bet there, though, is honestly, it's not going to be through me. It's not going to be through a search firm. It's going to be through your network. It's going to be getting to know companies that are early stage, talking with them, demonstrating value, showing that you can roll up your sleeves and get involved, and that's going to build the confidence you need. Again, from where we are, we're hired to do one specific thing, and because they're paying us a decent amount of cash to do it, we have to be very focused on bringing people to the table that have demonstrated, usually multiple times, exactly what they're looking to do.
That's great. Any other questions? One or 2 more? No? Okay. Over Jaya. Let's give her the mic.
So you mentioned about like when you are looking for a VP product for e-commerce company, you look for e-commerce vertical, right? So what suggestion you have for people who want to move from vertical to vertical? Say somebody, especially for enterprise space, like people are very, very picky. So somebody with storage experience, they only get to a storage company, from storage company to networking company. That's a big transition. How about moving from enterprise to consumer and vice versa? How do you see that?
Yeah, it's challenging. You have to start to essentially move towards the middle. So if you're not going to go direct, more likely than not, if you're doing storage, you're not going to go directly over to a photo app. That's just not going to happen. But you can start to move more towards the application side. And then from the application side, so instead of being in storage, you're maybe doing infrastructure optimization or some type of application layer. Get to the application layer, you can continue to move more towards from the IT side over towards the business side. And that's really the path you need to take to get over there. Sometimes you can do this within your own organization. Depends on how big it is and your opportunities within it. But you need to move much more towards the non-IT end user to be able to even put yourself in that conversation. And then from there, you need to move much more towards a business model that would yield a transition to a consumer company more successfully. So Dropbox or Box or stuff like that, or LinkedIn is another great one, where the individual who's using that could be just as much as a consumer as it could be using it for a business case. That makes that transition even easier. But you need to kind of take steps to get there. And sometimes that might be doing a transition within your company, might be doing 2 years at something else that's early. But you can bring a unique skill set there and you've built something before. It's not going to happen overnight, but there are ways to do it. It just takes time.
One more question? Okay, question in the back. Thank you. Thank you, Minnie.
Hey, Chris, thanks. My name is Soma. So, Chris, the question is, when you get feedback from the companies regarding the candidates they meet, do you see any difference when they meet women candidates versus men candidates? And if yes, what kind of companies would that be?
Yeah, not a ton, though I will be honest, I think most companies are probably a bit guarded about it a little bit. But no, I don't. And the reason being is this, a lot of my job is, and the success of the search is be able to take any candidate's story and tell that to a company in a compelling way. And if I don't do that successfully, if they don't see the value that this person could bring right off the bat, and then I'm going to get in just as much trouble for not delivering as any potential bad feedback could come. So for the most part, it's mostly about presence. It's about leadership style. It's about success and what they've done. It's about energy and culture fit. And those are the major things that disqualify people. And be honest, there's just as many people that are men that screw that up as women screw it up. It's not very differentiated. But those are the major things that really kind of separate what people from being successful and moving through a process and people that are going to get knocked out relatively early on.
Well, thank you so much, Chris.
Yeah.
I know that I was telling you earlier, and I still think this, you're going to be very popular with the ladies afterwards. So we're going to move on to